Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was trapped inside the Phantom Zone with no way out. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air tasted of ozone and pulverized concrete, a flavor Izuku Midoriya had come to associate with Tuesday mornings. The sky above Mizurufu was a fractured mosaic of blue and an angry, glitching static. It was as if someone had punched a hole in reality, and the wound was refusing to heal. Screams, both of terror and of heroic effort, were swallowed by the discordant hum emanating from the tears in space. Deku! Left flank! He's opening another one! Uravity's voice, strained but clear through his comms, cut through the chaos. Izuku's feet barely touched the ground. He was a green comet, propelled by the roaring furnace of One for All at a controlled 45%. Green lightning crackled around him, tracing his trajectory as he pivoted in midair using a whip of black energy that lashed out from his arm and anchored to the corner of a skeletal office building. The villain called himself Glitch. A fittingly simple name for a man whose quirk was causing such complex, dimensional havoc. He stood at the center of the devastation, a wiry man in a patchwork coat, laughing as shimmering, unstable portals bloomed around him like deadly flowers. Through one, you could see a glimpse of a windswept desert. Through another, the crushing depths of an ocean trench. They were not stable wormholes. They were wounds, bleeding visual noise and physical impossibilities into their world. "I've got it!" Izuku yelled back, his voice firm. He was no longer the stammering boy who broke his bones with every punch. He was Deku, the successor to All Might, a pillar in training. The vestiges of One for All were a silent, supportive chorus in the back of his mind, their combined experience a steadying hand on his soul. "Be precise, Ninth," Nana Shimura's voice seemed to whisper, a memory of a memory. "Power is nothing without control." He landed, his iron soles grating against the asphalt. A new portal, the size of a city bus, was tearing open directly in the path of a fleeing family. It shimmered with a pattern he hadn't seen yet, not a place, but a non-place. A void of monochromatic gray and unsettling geometric shapes that seemed to twist the light around it. His mind, a relentless analysis engine, was already working. The portals are manifestations of his will, but they're unstable. He can't perfectly control where or what they open to. The energy signature is chaotic. It's not folding space, it's breaking it. Endeavor was a roaring inferno on the other side of the plaza, his hell flame cauterizing smaller portals before they could fully form. Hawk's feathers were everywhere, plucking civilians from harm's way with breathtaking speed. But they were occupied. This one was his. The family, a father clutching his wife's hand, who in turn was trying to pull their young daughter along, had frozen. The little girl, no older than 7, with bright pink ribbons in her hair, had tripped. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the horrifying non-reality yawning before her. Time dilated. Izuku saw it all with a chilling clarity that only a true crisis can provide. The girl's small shoe untied. The father's desperate, outstretched hand. The way the very air seemed to pixelate and dissolve around the portal's edge. There was no time for a St. Louis smash. No time for a pinpoint Delaware smash Air Force. There was only time for one thing. The thing he had been born to do, even before he had a quirk to do it with. He moved. Black whip shot from his arms, not as an attack, but as an anchor. The tendrils wrapped around a sturdy lamppost 100 feet away, pulling taut. He pushed One for All to 55%, the surge of power a familiar, glorious burn in his muscles. He was a human slingshot. He didn't aim for the villain. He aimed for the girl. "It's okay!" he shouted, the sound ripped away by the portal's strange hum. He hoped the look in his eyes conveyed the message instead. "I've got you!" He reached her in a heartbeat. His armored glove scooped her up, his body curling around hers protectively. With his remaining momentum, he used float to give them an upward boost and then threw her, with all the controlled strength he could muster, towards her parents. It was a perfect, gentle arc. The father caught her, stumbling back, his face a mask of shocked relief. Izuku felt a flicker of triumph. A life saved. That was the core of it all. But his anchor point, the lamppost, chose that exact moment to buckle under the strain, torn from its concrete base by the dimensional shearing. His black whip snapped back, useless. His momentum, no longer directed, carried him forward, directly towards the gaping maw of the portal. He tried to fire another whip, to use float, to kick off the ground with a burst of power. But he was too close. The portal's event horizon was not a clean line. It was a voracious, sucking force. It pulled at him, not at his body, but at his very existence. The world dissolved into a deafening roar of static. Uravity's distant, panicked cry of "Deku!" was the last sound he heard from his world. Then, it too was gone, sheared away like everything else. The fall was not a fall. There was no wind resistance, no sense of direction, no up or down. It was a plunge through an abyss of non-sensation. His body was there, he thought, but he couldn't feel his own limbs. He was a disembodied consciousness adrift in a sea of nothing. The vibrant colors of his world, the blue sky, the red of Endeavor's fire, the green of his own lightning, were stripped away, leaving only a cacophony of gray and black. Then came the pain. It was a pain unlike any physical injury he had ever sustained. It was not a broken bone or a torn muscle. It was a spiritual evisceration, one for all, the sacred torch that had lived inside him, that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat, was being torn out. He felt it as a physical schism. A cold, surgical line was drawn down the center of his soul, and a fundamental part of him was being excised with brutal force. He felt the vestiges, his silent companions, his mentors, crying out. Not in words, but in pure, raw emotion. Yoichi Shigaraki, the first, felt like a foundational stone being pulverized. The second and third, their presences like stern, watchful guards, were shattered like glass. Haikid Shinomori's danger sense was a high-pitched scream of pure warning that suddenly went silent. Daigoro Banjo's black whip felt like phantom limbs being amputated, leaving searing, cold nerve endings. And Smokescreen was a shroud that was violently ripped away. And Nana Shimura, whose gentle warmth and fierce will had always felt like a guiding star, felt like that star had just gone supernova, then collapsed into a black hole of absolute nothingness. Finally, he felt the last, warmest ember, the echo of Tashinori Yagi, of All Might. It was the core of the flame, the pilot light of his heroism. He clung to it, his consciousness screaming, begging, pleading, "No, not this, please, anything but this." The ember didn't fight back. It simply faded. Like a candle flame in a hurricane, it flickered, sputtered, and was extinguished. The emptiness that rushed in was a physical violation. It was a void more terrifying than the abyss he was falling through. The silence in his soul was absolute, a perfect vacuum where a symphony had once played. The strength, the speed, the power, it all vanished. The familiar warmth in his core was replaced by a hollow, gnawing cold that sank into his very marrow. He was left with nothing. He was just Izuku Midoriya again. A boy in a costume, falling through nowhere. The non-sensation ended as abruptly as it began. Impact. His body remembered gravity before his mind did. He hit something hard, something unyielding. The air, if it was air, was driven from his lungs in a painful gasp. He felt a sharp, cracking sensation in his ribs. For a horrifying second, he thought he'd shattered his arm, a grim echo of his early days. But the pain was different, less the explosive agony of a self-inflicted break, more the brutal, mundane shock of a long fall. He lay there, sprawled on a surface that was both sharp and smooth, like obsidian glass. A groan escaped his lips, a raw, wounded sound. He pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. His head swam with vertigo. He took in his surroundings, and the last dregs of adrenaline in his system turned to ice. He was in a world drained of all color. The ground beneath him was a vast, jagged plain of crystalline structures, ranging in shade from slate gray to a deep, light-absorbing black. Massive, geometric shards of the same material floated lazily through the void above, drifting like silent, alien continents. There was no sun, no moon, no stars. The sky was a uniform, pearlescent white, a directionless, eternal twilight that provided a dim, shadowless illumination. There was no sound. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The constant hum of a city, the whisper of wind, the sound of his own breathing, all gone. When he gasped for breath, the only sound was the wet, internal noise inside his own head. The silence wasn't an absence of noise, it was a presence. A heavy, suffocating pressure that pushed him from all sides. His heart hammered against his bruised ribs, a frantic drumbeat in a dead world. Okay, think. Analyze the situation. The old habit, the bedrock of his mind, kicked in. Villain's quirk. Glitch. He creates unstable portals. I was pulled through one. This must be one of the destinations, a temporary pocket dimension. The others will get me out. They have to. The logic was sound. It was a life raft in an ocean of terror. He clung to it. He staggered to his feet, hissing as pain flared in his side. His costume was torn in several places, the tough fibers ripped by the sharp landing. His utility belt was mostly intact, a small blessing. He did a quick inventory. A few high-energy protein bars. A small medkit. His phone, its screen cracked and displaying a permanent NOS signal. Of course, he looked around, trying to find a landmark, a point of reference, anything. But the landscape was a maddening, repeating fractal of alien geology. There was no horizon, just an endless expanse of gray crystals under a white neon sky. The bizarre physics of the place became apparent as he took a few tentative steps. Gravity felt inconsistent. In one spot he felt heavy, his boots sticking to the ground. 3 steps to the left, and he felt unnervingly light, almost able to bound several feet into the air with a simple hop. It was disorienting, nauseating. But the logical part of his brain fought to override the panic. Variable gravity fields. Unstable dimension. It makes sense. I need to be careful. He needed to confirm his theory. That this was temporary. That his quirk was just being suppressed. He stopped, planting his feet as firmly as he could on a patch of ground that felt relatively normal. He closed his eyes, shutting out the oppressive monochrome landscape. He reached inside himself, to that place where One for All had lived, that roaring nexus of power. He focused, picturing the crackling green energy, the flow of power from his core down his arm, the satisfying surge before a smash. He clenched his fist. He waited. Nothing. Not a spark. Not a flicker of lightning. Not a whisper of the vestiges. Not even the faintest, residual warmth. The space inside him where his quirk should have been was a gaping, hollow wound. It was the phantom limb sensation magnified 1,000,000 times over. He could feel the shape of the power that was supposed to be there, but when he tried to grasp it, his metaphorical hand passed right through. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of his forced composure. No! He whispered, the sound dead and flat in the crushing silence. He tried again. Harder this time. He gritted his teeth, his muscles straining with the effort of remembered activation. He focused every ounce of his will, pouring it into that empty space, trying to reignite the pilot light himself. Come on, come on! He grunted, his voice a pathetic, swallowed noise. He could feel the muscle memory perfectly. He knew exactly how it should feel. The swell of energy, the thrum under his skin, the low hum that vibrated through his bones. The absence of it was a profound and terrifying violation. It was like trying to breathe without lungs. The instinct was there, the action was there, but the fundamental component was gone. He opened his eyes, staring at his gloved hand. It was just a hand. A normal, human hand. Trembling. The memories flooded him then, not as comfort, but as cruel torturers. The feeling of soaring through the sky with float, the city a beautiful tapestry below him. The satisfying snap of Black Whip connecting with its target. The overwhelming gratitude and weight of the moment All Might had passed the torch to him. That strand of golden hair a promise of a future he had so desperately craved. He remembered standing on a beach of illegally dumped trash, a scrawny, powerless boy, dragging a refrigerator. He remembered the doctor's words, the extra joint in his pinky toe a death sentence for his dreams. He remembered the crushing despair of being told, "You can't be a hero." He had overcome that. He had been given a miracle. He had worked, bled, and broken himself over and over again to be worthy of that miracle. And now, it was gone. He was back on that beach. But there was no All Might to find him. There was no trash to clean up. There was only this endless, silent gray hell. No, he said again, his voice cracking. He shook his head, a violent, jerky motion. No. No, 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 this couldn't be it. It was a trick. A powerful quirk-suppressing field. That had to be it. When they pulled him out, it would come back. It had to. The alternative was too unthinkable to even contemplate. To be given the world, only to have it ripped away. To be shown the sun, only to be cast into eternal darkness. The sheer, cosmic injustice of it all began to bubble up inside him, a hysterical, burning pressure in his chest. The carefully constructed walls of his analytical mind, his heroic composure, began to crack. The terror he had been holding at bay flooded through the fissures. He was alone. He was hurt. He was powerless. He was trapped. A sound tore from his throat, raw and ragged. It wasn't a word. It was a primal expression of absolute despair. He threw his head back and screamed, pouring every ounce of his fear, his loss, his rage, and his utter, soul-crushing hopelessness into that single, desperate sound. The scream was a cannon blast in the silence. It was the loudest thing in this universe. For a split second, it was a rebellion against the oppressive quiet, and then the phantom zone answered. The sound didn't echo. It didn't travel. It simply stopped. It was as if the silence was a thick, viscous fluid that smothered the vibration the moment it left his lips. The scream went no further than a few feet from his own face before it was utterly and completely devoured, leaving behind a silence that felt even deeper, more profound, and more mocking than before. His cry for help, his roar of defiance, his plea to the universe, it had been swallowed by the void without a trace. It had meant nothing. The finality of that simple, impossible piece of physics broke him. His knees buckled. He fell to the sharp, crystalline ground, his hands scraping against the unforgiving surface. He didn't feel the pain. All he felt was the howling abyss that had opened up inside him, an emptiness that perfectly mirrored the desolate reality around him. He was Izuku Midoriya. He was 15 years old. He had been a hero, and he was trapped inside Superman's prison, with no quirks and no help. And for the first time in a very long time, he had absolutely no idea what to do. The silence pressed in, and inside its cold, heavy embrace, the ghost of a hero began to weep. The silence that followed his scream was a living entity. It pressed down on Izuku's back, a physical weight that pinned him to the razor-sharp crystalline floor. His shoulders shook with ragged, soundless sobs. Each tremor sent a fresh spike of agony through his bruised ribs, a brutal, physical anchor to his new reality. He lay there for a period that had no name, not seconds, not minutes. Time had been flayed of its meaning, leaving only the raw, pulsating now. His mind, a vessel that had once held the wisdom of 8 heroic souls, felt scoured clean. The vibrant inner world of One for All, the council of vestiges, the hum of latent power, the comforting presence of All Might's echo, was gone. In its place was a vast, echoing chamber of pure Izuku Midoriya. And Izuku Midoriya, alone and powerless, was terrified. Despair was a thick, syrupy poison, and he was drowning in it. It would be so easy to just stop. To let the strange, cold twilight of this place bleach the life from him. To close his eyes and let the silence swallow him whole, just as it had swallowed his scream. It was a tempting thought, a siren song of surrender in a sea of suffering. No more struggle. No more pain. Just an end. But even in the deepest pit of his despair, a stubborn, deeply ingrained mechanism refused to shut down. It was the part of him that had spent a decade filling notebooks with hero analysis. The part that had dragged a refrigerator across a beach until his muscles tore. The part that had looked a sludge monster in the eye and run forward on instinct alone. It was the analyst. The fighter. The survivor. Get up. The thought was not a heroic command. It was a cold, pragmatic whisper from the deepest part of his brain stem. Lying here is a tactical disadvantage. You are exposed. You are losing body heat. Your injuries need assessment. He pushed the thought away. What was the point? Tactical disadvantage against what? The rocks? The silence? Unknown threats, the analyst corrected, its voice devoid of emotion. You have data for only one variable, yourself. The environment is the second. There could be a third. Assume there is a third. A memory surfaced unbidden. A training exercise in the unforeseen simulation joint. Aizawa-sensei's words, sharp and logical as he erased their quirks. A hero who can only fight with their power is no hero at all. They're a liability. Your first weapon is your mind. Use it, or you'll be useless. The memory was a splash of ice water. Here, the lesson was literal. His mind was all he had left. With a groan that was half pain and half resignation, Izuku began to move. He pushed himself onto his hands and knees, the sharp edges of the crystal ground digging into his palms through the fabric of his gloves. The world swam, a nauseating vortex of gray and white. He squeezed his eyes shut, took a deep, shuddering breath. The air was thin, cold, and utterly neutral, with no scent of dust or life, and waited for the vertigo to pass. He did a mental inventory of his body. The pain in his left side was sharp and localized. A cracked or broken rib, most likely. Multiple bruises were forming, deep aches that promised to stiffen his movements. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent beat. Nothing life-threatening, but in a place with no doctors, no recovery girl, every injury was a potential death sentence. An infection, a fall, a misstep, there were no safety nets here. He forced himself into a low crouch, his eyes scanning the alien landscape. It was still the same, an endless, jagged vista of crystalline formations under a shadowless sky. The silence was still absolute. But now, with the analyst at the helm, he saw it differently. Not as a hellscape of despair, but as a problem to be solved. A hostile environment with rules he needed to learn. Rule 1 was already becoming clear, the physics were a lie. He took a step, and his foot landed with a heavy, jarring thud, as if his weight had momentarily doubled. He stumbled, catching himself before he could fall. He took another step, into a patch of ground that looked identical, and this time his foot barely seemed to connect. He felt light, buoyant, the pull of gravity a mere suggestion. He pushed off gently and floated a full 5 feet forward before settling back to the ground with the softest of impacts. Variable gravity pockets, the analyst noted, cold and detached. No visual indicators. Must test the ground before committing weight. Movement will be slow and treacherous. He spent the next period, what his internal clock screamed was at least an hour, just walking. He moved with the cautious, shuffling gait of a man on thin ice. He'd tap a spot with his toe, testing the gravitational pull, before shifting his weight. He learned to read the subtle cues he'd missed before. A patch of crystals that seemed to hum with a faint, internal vibration was likely a high-gravity zone. An area where the ambient, dim light seemed to bend ever so slightly was often a low-gravity one. He was a scientist in a laboratory of madness, and his own survival was the subject of the experiment. He needed shelter. A place to rest, to think, to be safe from whatever else might be here. He scanned the floating islands of rock above. Some were the size of houses, others as large as city blocks. They drifted in slow, silent orbits, occasionally bumping into one another with a total lack of sound that was deeply unsettling. A collision that should have produced a cataclysmic roar of shattering rock happened in perfect, eerie silence. He saw one of the smaller, house-sized shards begin to drift lower. As it descended, it passed through one of the invisible gravity fields, and its trajectory changed violently. It went from a lazy float to a catastrophic plummet, smashing into the ground a few hundred yards from him. The impact sent silent shockwaves through the crystal plane, but the only sound was the grating of his own teeth as he watched, horrified. Rule 2, his mind supplied. The environment itself is a threat. Nowhere is truly safe. He pressed on, his thirst becoming a dry, scratchy presence in the back of his throat. He reached for the water pouch on his belt, his fingers hesitating. He had a finite supply. Less than a liter. He allowed himself a single, small sip, the lukewarm water a small miracle on his tongue. He had 3 protein bars. His medkit contained bandages, antiseptic wipes, and pain suppressants. A pitiful arsenal against the dimension. It was then that he saw it. Far in the distance, a flicker of movement. He froze instantly, dropping into a low crouch behind a jagged outgrowth of black crystal. His heart, which had settled into a steady, anxious rhythm, kicked into a frantic gallop. The sound of it thundered in his ears, a desperate drum in the silent world. He peered through a gap in the crystals, his eyes straining. It was a figure. Tall and gaunt, moving with a slow, loping gait that seemed perfectly adapted to the shifting gravity. It was humanoid, with 2 arms and 2 legs, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs were too long, its torso too thin. It was draped in what looked like tattered, dark rags, and it carried a long, metallic pole that it used like a walking staff, tapping the ground ahead of it. Izuku's mind split into 2 warring factions. The hero, the boy who had thrown himself in front of a portal to save a child just hours ago, screamed, someone else. Another victim. They could be hurt. They could need help. I have to go to them. The analyst, the cold, pragmatic survivor forged in the last hour, countered with icy logic. Unknown entity. Assume hostile. Its posture is not that of a victim, it is that of a predator. It is adapted to this environment. You are not. Observation is the only logical course of action. He watched, his breath held tight in his chest. The being stopped, using its pole to pry something from a fissure in the crystals. It looked like a phosphorescent, moss-like substance. The creature scraped some of it into a leather pouch at its hip, then continued on its way, its head constantly swiveling, scanning the terrain. It's foraging, Izuku realized. It lives here. It survives here. This wasn't another newcomer. This was a resident. An inmate. The hero in him refused to be silent. But what if they're not a villain? What if they were trapped here, just like me? What if they're just another person trying to survive? Maybe we can help each other. The idea was a beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. The thought of not being alone, of having an ally, was so powerful, so seductive, that it began to override his caution. To face this place with someone else, it would make all the difference. He had built his entire heroic career on teamwork, on trust, on the bonds forged with his friends at UA. The instinct to reach out, to connect, was as fundamental to him as breathing. A calculated risk, he told himself, trying to frame his hope in the language of logic. Gaining an ally is a massive strategic advantage. The potential reward outweighs the potential danger. It was a flimsy justification, and he knew it. He wasn't making a tactical decision. He was making a desperate, hopeful one. He was choosing to believe in the possibility of good, even in a place that looked like the very definition of evil. He made his decision. He waited for the figure to pass behind a large, floating crystalline monolith. Then he broke from his cover. He moved as quietly as he could, his sock-clad feet making less noise than his armored boots would have. He kept a low profile, darting from one jagged piece of cover to the next, closing the distance. He got within 50 feet before he stopped, his heart pounding. He could see the being more clearly now. Its skin was the color of faded parchment, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. It had no discernible nose, only 2 vertical slits above a thin, lipless mouth. Its eyes were large, black, and filmed over, like those of a deep-sea fish. It was undeniably alien, but it was also undeniably intelligent. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Hello?" he called out. The word was pathetic, swallowed by the silence before it had even fully formed. The creature didn't react. Of course. Sound didn't travel. He stepped out from behind his cover, raising a hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "Hello?" He tried again, this time shouting, waving his hand more deliberately. The creature's head snapped in his direction. Its movements were unnervingly fast. Those milky eyes fixed on him, and for the first time, Izuku felt a genuine spike of fear. Not the existential dread from before, but the primal fear of a prey animal that has just caught the attention of a predator. But he had committed. He couldn't back down now. He held his hand up, palm open, and took a slow, deliberate step forward. He pointed to himself. "Izuku Midoriya," he said, enunciating the name clearly, though he knew the sound was useless. He then pointed to the creature, an inquisitive look on his face. The alien creature tilted its head. It let out a low, guttural noise, a series of clicks and pops that sounded like grinding rocks. "Kryltch think." It seemed to be its name, or its species. It gripped its metal pole tighter. Izuku's heroic optimism surged. It was communicating. This was working. He fumbled with the pouch on his utility belt, his fingers clumsy with a mixture of hope and adrenaline. He pulled out one of his 3 precious protein bars. It was his most valuable resource, a condensed packet of life-sustaining energy. He held it out, and offering a gesture of goodwill, he took another step forward. That was his mistake. He had crossed an invisible line. The creature, which he mentally dubbed Kryll, reacted not with curiosity, but with explosive violence. It lunged forward, covering the distance between them in 2 impossibly long strides. It moved with a terrifying grace, its body flowing through the shifting gravity as if it were water. Izuku's Yue combat training kicked in instantly. He dropped into a defensive stance, his mind screaming at him to activate One for All, an instinct that was now a phantom limb. He saw the metal pole swinging towards his head in a wide arc. He ducked under it, the wind from its passage stirring his hair. He came up inside the creature's guard, his fist lashing out in a tight, controlled jab aimed at its solar plexus. It was a perfect punch. Well-timed, well-aimed, backed by the toned muscles of a body honed by years of relentless training. It connected with a solid thud, and it did almost nothing. Kryll grunted, a short, sharp exhalation of that thin, scentless air, and took a half-step back. But there was no real damage. It was like punching a concrete wall wrapped in leather. The shock of the impact vibrated up Izuku's arm, a painful reminder of his own powerlessness. He had put all his strength into that blow, a punch that, without his quirk, was merely the punch of a fit, desperate teenager. He saw the look in Kryll's milky eyes change. Before, it had been cautious, predatory. Now, there was a flicker of something else, contempt. It had assessed him. It had found him wanting. The counterattack was brutally efficient. The butt of the metal pole slammed into his already injured ribs. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded in his side. The air rushed from his lungs, and he staggered back, gasping. Before he could recover, Kryll swept his legs out from under him with the pole. He hit the crystalline ground hard, the back of his head cracking against the unyielding surface. Stars, pale, colorless ghosts, danced in his vision. The world tilted on its axis. He tried to push himself up, his arms trembling, but Kryll was on him in an instant. A heavy, 3-toed foot pressed down on his chest, pinning him. The pressure was immense, driving the last of the air from his lungs. He choked, his vision starting to blacken at the edges. He looked up into those blank, milky eyes and saw nothing. No malice, no anger, no cruelty. Just a cold, dispassionate efficiency. This wasn't a fight. This was pest control. Or worse, resource acquisition. Kryll's long, spindly fingers reached for his utility belt. With a sharp tug, it ripped the main pouch free. The creature inspected the contents with a series of curious clicks. It tossed the useless medkit aside. It sniffed the remaining 2 protein bars, then shoved them into its own pouch. It looked at his phone, tapped the cracked screen, and seeing it was inert, discarded it as well. It had taken everything of value in under 10 seconds. Izuku lay there, helpless, pinned, watching as his last hopes for survival were stolen by the very being he had tried to help. The irony was so bitter it felt like acid in his throat. Kryll looked down at him one last time, its lipless mouth a flat, emotionless line. Then, without a second thought, it removed its foot and turned, loping away into the gray desolation as if nothing had happened. It didn't even bother to finish him off. He wasn't worth the energy. He was just a strange, weak creature who had briefly interrupted its foraging. He was beneath its notice. He was left for dead. Izuku lay there, gasping, as the creature disappeared into the monochrome gloom. The pain in his ribs was a raging fire. His head felt like it had been split open. Every inch of his body ached with a profound, humiliating defeat. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the death of his hope. The brutal reality of his situation crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. His idealism, his core belief in the inherent goodness of others, the very foundation of his heroic identity. It was a fatal flaw here. His attempt at connection, at offering aid, had not been seen as an act of kindness. It had been seen as a display of weakness. He had willingly revealed his resources to a competitor, and that competitor had taken them without hesitation. He had not been in a potential alliance. He had been in a negotiation with a predator, and he had offered himself up as a meal. A memory of All Might's smiling face flashed in his mind. You can be a hero. The words, once his salvation, now tasted like ash. A hero? A hero saves people. A hero inspires hope. A hero stands as a symbol of peace. Here, there was no one to save. There was no hope to inspire. There was no peace, only a silent, brutal struggle for existence. He had tried to be a hero. He had approached Kerwilo with compassion and an open hand. And in return, he had been beaten, robbed, and left to die on the cold, sharp ground. His heroism was not just useless here, it was a liability, a dangerous, naive impulse that would get him killed. This was the first lesson of the Phantom Zone. It was a lesson taught not in a classroom or a training ground, but in blood and pain and humiliation. There is no mercy, there is no camaraderie, there is no heroism, there is only survival. Slowly, painfully, Izuku began to crawl. He couldn't stand. He dragged his broken body across the crystals, leaving a small, pathetic trail. He wasn't crawling towards a goal. He was just crawling away from the spot of his own stupidity. He needed to hide. He needed to disappear. He found a small crevice, a dark crack in the base of a towering crystal formation, barely wide enough for him to squeeze into. He wedged himself deep inside, the cold, smooth walls pressing in on him from all sides. It was dark. It was cramped. It was a tomb. It was safe. He curled into a tight ball, cradling his throbbing ribs, and listened. He listened to the frantic, terrified drumming of his own heart. He listened to the ragged sound of his own breathing, and he listened to the silence. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghost of a loping, gaunt figure. It was pregnant with the promise of other, unseen things that followed the same brutal rules. He was not alone in this dimension. He was simply at the bottom of its food chain. The boy who wanted to be a hero was gone, beaten out of him and left for dead on the crystalline plains. In his place, something else was beginning to stir. Something colder, harder, and more pragmatic. The analyst was no longer just a part of his mind. It was now in command. Its first order was simple, echoing in the ruins of his hope. Learn. Adapt. Endure. In the dark, silent crevice, hidden from the world, Izuku Midoriya understood. His education had just begun. The universe had been compressed into a single, agonizing point, the throb of his ribs with every shallow breath. Izuku lay wedged in the dark, cold crevice, a coffin of black crystal that was both his prison and his sanctuary. Time had ceased to be a river and had become a stagnant, lightless pool. He measured its passage not in hours or days, but in cycles of pain. The sharp, lancing agony of a cracked rib would flare, hold its breath, and then subside into a dull, persistent ache. That was one cycle. He had counted hundreds. He was at rock bottom. This wasn't the despair of failure, like losing a match at the sports festival. It wasn't the righteous fury of seeing a friend harmed. This was a deeper, more elemental abyss. It was the despair of absolute solitude, of utter insignificance. The universe didn't care that he was here. His pain was a silent, unobserved event in a dimension that had no memory. His body, starved and dehydrated, was beginning to betray him. A constant, low-grade fever had set in, born from the untreated injuries and the unnatural chill of the zone. It brought with it a procession of ghosts. They weren't the wise vestiges of One for All. They were cruel specters conjured by his own fracturing mind, memories twisted into instruments of torture. He would drift into a hazy state between waking and sleep, and Uraraka would be there. She wasn't smiling her usual, bright smile. Her face, framed by her familiar brown bob, was etched with a desperate concern that cut him deeper than any physical blow. "Deku-kun? Where are you? We've been looking everywhere." Her voice, a perfect phantom echo in the silent cave, was not a comfort. It was an accusation. He had vanished. He had left a void in their lives, a wound of worry and fear. Then it would be Ida, his hand chopping the air with its typical rigid precision, but his movements were frantic, his glasses askew. Midoriya! Your disappearance is an unauthorized breach of protocol. We must locate you immediately. The search grids have been tripled. The thought of his friends, of the entire hero society, searching for him was a unique agony. They were looking in the wrong world. They were searching for a boy who, for all intents and purposes, no longer existed. Their efforts, their care, their love, it was all firing into the void. Sometimes, it was Todoroki, standing silently in the gray twilight, his heterochromatic eyes filled with a quiet, profound disappointment. He wouldn't say a word. He didn't need to. The look was enough. Izuku had fought to break down the walls around his friend's heart, to show him the hero he could be. And now, he had simply disappeared, leaving that fragile friendship to wither in his absence. The most jarring visitations came from Kaken. Bakugo wouldn't be worried. He would be incandescent with rage. Izuku could practically feel the heat of his explosions, hear his voice roaring, not in the cave, but in his skull. DKU! You damn nerd, where the hell did you go? You think you can just get vaporized by some D-list villain and leave me behind? Who am I supposed to beat now? It was a twisted comfort, the knowledge that Kaken's fury was a form of caring, a bond forged in fire and rivalry that refused to be broken even by dimensional barriers. But it was a comfort that burned. He had broken their unspoken promise, to stand on the same stage, to push each other to the absolute pinnacle of heroism. But the ghost that brought him to his knees, even in his mind, was his mother. He saw her in their small apartment, the faint scent of katsudon clinging to the air. She wasn't crying her usual waterfalls of tears. She was quiet. A terrible, hollow quiet, sitting at the kitchen table, clutching one of his old, worn all-might figures. Her shoulders were slumped, the light had gone out of her eyes. He had promised her he would be careful. He had promised her he would come home. He was her only son, the boy she had feared for, protected, and ultimately supported with every fiber of her being. And he had broken her heart in the most absolute way possible, by vanishing from existence. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on him, threatening to pulverize his already fractured spirit. I have to end this, a voice whispered in the back of his mind. It was a calm, rational voice, the kind of voice that speaks when all other options have been exhausted. It wasn't the voice of despair anymore. It was the voice of logic. The suffering was immense. The future was a flat, gray line extending into infinity. There was no hope of rescue. There was no way out. Continuing to exist was simply prolonging the agony. The fight was over. He had lost. His hand, trembling with fever and weakness, brushed against something on the floor of his crevice. It was a shard of the black crystal, knocked loose when he'd crawled inside. It was the size of his palm, and one edge had flaked off into a wickedly sharp point. He picked it up. The stone was cold, heavy, real. It felt like a part of this world, a tool forged by the dimension that had unmade him. He looked at the inside of his wrist, at the pale skin where blue veins traced a map of his life. It would be so simple. One sharp, deep cut. The pain would be brief, a final flare before the darkness took him. It would be an escape. The only escape this place offered. He would finally be free of the hunger, the pain, the guilt, the ghosts. He would be free of the silence. His fingers tightened around the shard. He brought the point to his skin. The cold tip sent a shiver through his entire body. He closed his eyes, his mind filled with the image of his mother's grieving face. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." He pressed down. The sharp edge pricked his skin, and then, a different ghost appeared. It wasn't a memory born of feverish guilt. It was something deeper, a foundational pillar of his soul. It was All Might, but not the towering symbol of peace. It was the skeletal, blood-spitting Tashinori Yagi, standing on a rooftop, his voice raw with passion and conviction. And the words echoed not in his ears, but in the very core of his being. "You can be a hero." The memory was so powerful, so vivid, it was like a physical jolt. He froze, the crystal point trembling against his wrist. The words had been his genesis. They were the key that had unlocked his entire world. He had built his life on that single, impossible sentence. But what did it mean now? How could he be a hero here? There was no one to save. There was nothing to protect. A new thought, cold and sharp as the crystal in his hand, cut through the fog of his despair. What if being a hero isn't about saving other people? What if, right now, the most heroic thing you can do is save yourself? The idea was revolutionary. Heroism wasn't just capes and punches and rescuing civilians. Heroism was the indomitable will to face down overwhelming odds. All might, emaciated and dying, getting up to fight all for one last time. That was heroism. Sir Nightai, impaled and bleeding out, using his last moments to secure a future for others. That was heroism. It was the refusal to surrender. The refusal to break. To give up now, to let this place win, to let his own despair kill him. That would be the ultimate betrayal of everything All Might had seen in him. It would be spitting on the graves of the vestiges who had entrusted their sacred power to him. He had lost their power, yes. But their will? Their spirit? Did that have to die too? No. His grip on the crystal shard changed. The pressure on his wrist vanished. He slowly, deliberately, turned his hand over. He was no longer holding the shard like a blade. He was holding it like a pen. His eyes snapped open. The despair hadn't vanished, but it had receded. In its place was a flicker of something he hadn't felt since he arrived, purpose. Cold, grim, and stripped of all idealism, but purpose nonetheless. He wouldn't die here. He wouldn't let this dimension have the satisfaction. If he was going to be trapped in hell, he would become its most knowledgeable inmate. He would learn its rules, map its geography, and understand its inhabitants. He would survive not through power, but through sheer, stubborn intellect. He would turn this prison into his laboratory. The analyst, which had been whispering survival tips, now roared to life, taking full command. It was no longer just a part of him, it was him. He pushed himself out of the crevice. The movement was agony. His ribs screamed, his head pounded, and his muscles, atrophied from disuse, trembled violently. But he was moving. He was acting. His cave was small, but deeper inside, away from the entrance, the wall flattened out into a large, smooth slab of dark gray crystal, about the size of a door. It was perfect, a blackboard in the heart of oblivion. He took the sharp crystal shard, his new pen, and pressed it against the stone slab. He scraped it across the surface. Scree! The noise was horrific. It was the sound of grinding teeth, of nails on a chalkboard, magnified 1,000 times in the oppressive silence. It was a violent, physical assault on his eardrums, but it was a sound he had made. It was an act of defiance. He was leaving a mark on this place that had tried to erase him. He ignored the ringing in his ears and began to write. His hand was shaky, his movements clumsy, but the letters he scratched into the stone were deliberate. At the top of the slab, in big, jagged characters, he etched a title. It was a tribute to the boy he used to be, and a mission statement for the man he was being forced to become. Hero Analysis for Survival, Volume 1. Looking at the words, a grim, humorless smile touched his lips for the first time. It felt alien on his face. He was back to where he started, a quirkless nobody, with nothing but a notebook and a desperate, burning need to understand. He began with what he knew. His first entry was a profile of the creature that had almost killed him, the one that had taught him his first, brutal lesson. Entry 001, the inhabitants, phantoms. Classification, predator-scavenger. Designation, Scavenger 1, KRYL. Underneath the heading, he sketched a stick figure, doing his best to capture the creature's gaunt proportions, its long limbs, and the pole it carried. Physical traits, approximate, 2.5 meters tall. Skeletal frame. High muscle density despite thinness, proven via impact resistance. Skin, pale, leathery. Eyes large, black, milky film. No visible nose. Locomotion, loping gait. Perfectly adapted to variable gravity fields. Uses pole for stability and probing. Moves with extreme speed and efficiency when hostile. Behavioral analysis. Primary drive, foraging/resource acquisition. Non-aggressive unless provoked or valuable resources are presented. Territorial. Possesses a defined patrol route, sketched below. Avoid this route at all costs. Threat assessment, highly efficient. Gauged my lack of power instantly. Disengaged after neutralizing me and seizing resources. Conserves energy. Does not kill for sport, only for advantage. Critical conclusion: idealism is a vulnerability. Compassion is a target. Do not approach. Do not engage. Do not exist in its presence. The scavenger is not a person, it is a force of nature in this ecosystem. It follows the rules. I must learn them better. He paused, his arm aching from the effort. The act of turning his traumatic, humiliating memory into a collection of cold, hard data points was strangely cathartic. It stripped the event of its emotional power, reframing it as a learning experience. He hadn't been defeated. He had gathered crucial intelligence at a high but acceptable cost. His mind was clearer now, focused. He moved on to the next section, dedicating it to the world itself. Entry 002, the environment, the zone, physics, geography, gravity pockets, unstable, unpredictable fields, designation, sinks, high-G fields, identifiable by faint internal hum/vibration in crystals. Avoid. High energy cost to traverse, designation, lifts, low-G fields, identifiable by subtle light distortion. Useful for rapid, quiet movement if the trajectory is predictable. High risk. Crystal composition, not uniform. Designation, shatterstone. Lighter gray, brittle. Unstable. Source of falling debris. Do not use for shelter. Potentially useful for creating diversions. Sound. Designation, corestone. Darker gray/black. Highly dense and stable. Ideal for shelter. My current location is a corestone formation. Atmosphere acoustics, thin, cold, no discernible scent. Sound does not propagate normally. It is absorbed/dampened almost instantly. Vocalizations are useless for communication or distress calls. This provides an advantage. Silent movement is truly silent. He kept scratching, the grating noise becoming a steady rhythm, the soundtrack to his rebirth. He added a small, crude map of his immediate surroundings, marking the location of the sink he'd stumbled into, the flight path of the falling rock he'd witnessed, and the patrol route of Scavenger 1. His goal, once a desperate, nebulous fantasy of escape, was now crystallizing into something tangible. Something achievable. Mission Directive 1. Survive. Secure a stable water source. Secure a sustainable food source. Avoid all threats. 2. Learn, fully map the immediate sector. Identify all inhabitants and their behaviors. Understand the zone's physics completely. Knowledge is the only weapon I have. 3. Endure, maintain mental discipline. Despair is a luxury. Hope for rescue is a distraction. The only person coming to save me is myself. He worked until his arms seized up, until his head swam with exhaustion. He scraped and carved until the tips of his fingers were raw from gripping the sharp crystal. Finally, he slumped back against the opposite wall, his body screaming in protest, and looked at his work. It was a crude, ugly thing, scratched into a rock in the middle of nowhere. But it was the most beautiful thing he had ever created. It was a testament to his will. It was proof that he was still here. It was page 1 of the Bible of his new existence. The ghost had not vanished. The hunger still gnawed at his stomach, and the pain in his ribs was a constant companion. But they no longer held dominion over him. He had found a purpose in the purposelessness. He had found a structure in the chaos. He had been Izuku Midoriya, the hopeful hero. He had been Deku, the successor to All Might. Now, looking at his work etched in stone, he was something else. He was the analyst. He was the survivor. He closed his eyes, not in despair, but in calculated rest. The silence of the phantom zone pressed in, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an opportunity. In a world where no one could hear you scream, no one could hear you think either. He had found his secret weapon. It wasn't a fist. It was his mind, and in the quiet darkness of his cave, he began to sharpen it. The passage of time had a new name, a cycle. A cycle began when the dull ache of hunger in Izuku's belly sharpened into a predator's snarl. It ended when he returned to the sanctuary of his crevice, having consumed just enough to quell the beast for another period of rest and analysis. He was living a primal, minimalist existence, stripped down to the barest components of survival: find sustenance, avoid threats, conserve energy. His notebook for survival, the sprawling mural of scratched symbols and jagged text on the wall of his cave, was his new religion. He was its sole author and most devout follower. Before each scavenging run, he would study it, his fingers tracing the crude map of his small territory, reinforcing the lessons learned in pain and observation. Rule 4. Assume everything is a resource until proven otherwise. Rule 5. Patience is a form of armor. Rule 6. The zone does not reward boldness, only calculation. His first major breakthrough had come during his third cycle. Driven by a thirst so profound his tongue felt like a piece of dry leather, he had investigated the faint, phosphorescent moss he'd seen the creature KRYL harvesting. He found a small patch of it growing in a deep fissure, pulsing with a soft, ghostly light. His analyst mind took over. Hypothesis. The organism is chemotrophic or radiotrophic, feeding on the ambient, unnatural energy of the zone itself. The light is a byproduct of its metabolic process. It contains energy and, likely, moisture. The risk of poison was high, but the certainty of death by dehydration was higher. He performed a risk assessment that would have made Aizawa-sensei proud. He touched a tiny piece to his tongue. No immediate numbness, no burning. He waited a full rest period. No ill effects. He then ate a thumbnail-sized piece. It was gritty, tasteless, and had the consistency of wet sand, but it was miraculously wet. The moisture eased the fire in his throat. It wasn't water, but it was a substitute. It was life. Now, foraging for this ghost moss was the central pillar of his routine. But he knew it wasn't enough. It provided hydration and staved off the worst of the hunger pangs, but it offered virtually no real energy. He was slowly, inexorably wasting away. His costume hung loosely on his shrinking frame, and a constant, weary chill had settled deep into his bones. He needed something more. He needed to expand his territory. He needed to take a calculated risk. The plan formed over 2 cycles of meticulous observation from the mouth of his cave. He had identified a new region, further than he had ever dared to venture, where the crystal formations were denser and the shadows, what passed for shadows in this dim world, were deeper. It was also, unfortunately, closer to the patrol route of Scavenger 1. Direct confrontation was suicide. Evasion was unreliable. Therefore, the only option was misdirection. He spent a full cycle gathering materials. He found a small cluster of shatterstone, the brittle, lighter-colored crystals he'd identified in his notebook. Using a larger, heavier piece of core stone, he painstakingly broke the shatterstone into dozens of smaller, fist-sized shards. It was exhausting work, his atrophied muscles screaming in protest, the grating sound of the breaking rock a torment to his ears. But he persisted, driven by the cold logic of his plan. His timing had to be perfect. He watched from a hidden vantage point as Scavenger 1 appeared on the horizon, a gaunt silhouette moving with its familiar, loping grace. It was on the far side of its patrol route, moving away from his target area. He had a window. It wouldn't be large. He moved, his sock-clad feet making no sound on the crystalline ground. He carried a makeshift sling woven from strips of fabric from his tattered costume, cradling a single shard of shatterstone. He reached a predetermined point, a ridge overlooking a deep chasm filled with more of the brittle crystal. He took a deep breath, picturing the trajectory in his mind. He wasn't aiming for the creature. He was aiming for a spot 100 yards to its left, a spot he had marked on his mental map as being particularly unstable. He whirled the sling, a phantom echo of using Black Whip, and released. The shard flew, a silent gray missile against the white sky. He didn't wait to see it land. He immediately dropped and scrambled back into cover, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his sore ribs. A few moments later, a silent tremor ran through the ground. He couldn't hear it, but he could see it. A plume of shattered crystal dust rose from the chasm, a silent, gray explosion. It was exactly as he'd planned. A rock slide. An environmental event. Unnatural, but not overtly hostile. He risked a peek. Scavenger 1 had stopped. Its head was cocked, its milky eyes fixed on the disturbance. It was curious. Cautious. It altered its course, moving to investigate the source of the rock slide, away from its normal path and, more importantly, away from Izuku's destination. The diversion had worked. Rule 7, his mind supplied as he began to move, swift and silent, in the opposite direction. The environment can be a weapon and a tool. Learn to speak its language. He entered the new territory. The crystal formations here were different, twisted into strange, almost organic shapes like petrified trees. The air felt colder. The silence deeper. He moved with heightened senses, his eyes scanning every shadow, every crevice. This was the most exposed he had been since his arrival. He was foraging in a deep fissure, scraping a meager harvest of ghost moss into his pouch, when he saw it. It wasn't a flicker of movement, or a strange formation. It was a glint of light. In a world of matte gray and muted white, it was a profound anomaly. It was a single, sharp spark, like sunlight reflecting off a piece of glass. But there was no sun. He froze, his body going rigid. The analyst took over, processing the impossible data. The light was coming from the top of a high ridge in the distance. It was a reflection. A reflection implies a smooth, polished, non-crystalline surface. That implied something artificial. Man-made. Or alien-made. His survival instinct screamed at him to retreat, to return to the known safety of his cave. An unknown anomaly was a potential threat of the highest order. But his curiosity, the core engine of the boy who filled notebooks, was a far more powerful force. This was the first thing he had seen in this entire dimension that did not belong to the native geology. It was a clue. It was a breadcrumb. He made a decision that violated half the rules in his own notebook. He began to move towards the light. The journey took the rest of the cycle. He moved with agonizing slowness, darting from cover to cover, spending long periods in absolute stillness, just watching, listening to the silence. As he got closer, the source of the reflection became clearer. It was metal, a vast, impossibly large expanse of dark, non-reflective metal that was half buried in the crystalline plane, canted at a severe angle. The glint he had seen was from a single, small section where the outer hull had been breached, revealing a polished inner surface. It was a machine. A vehicle. It was a wreck. The scale of it was breathtaking. It was larger than any building in Mizurufu, larger even than Yue High School. It was like a mountain of strange, black metal had fallen from the sky. The architecture was alien, all flowing curves and sharp, aggressive angles, with no right angles to be found. It hummed, a low, deep thrum that was not a sound, but a vibration he could feel in the soles of his feet and the bones of his chest. It was the hum of dormant, colossal power. He had stumbled upon a tomb. Or a treasure chest. His analyst mind reeled with the possibilities. Technology. A power source. Tools. Shelter. Information. A way out? He ruthlessly suppressed that last thought. Hope was a poison. But the other possibilities were intoxicating. He spent another full cycle just observing the wreck from a safe distance, hidden in a deep network of crystalline trenches. He circled it, mapping its perimeter, noting the massive breaches in its hull that served as gaping, dark mouths. This place was not uninhabited. He saw figures, other phantoms, moving in and out of the wreckage. They were different from Scavenger 1. They were more varied, some bulky and brutish, others lithe and quick. They moved in disorganized, squabbling packs, like hyenas fighting over a carcass. A small, violent society had formed around this fallen giant. This was a death trap. Every instinct screamed it. But the potential rewards, they were a siren song he couldn't ignore. He needed a better vantage point, a place where he could observe the inner politics of this new tribe without being seen. He found it on a high, precarious spire of coarse stone that overlooked the main entrance to the wreck. The climb was terrifying. The variable gravity made every handhold a gamble. A sink could plaster him to the rock face. A lift could send him floating out into the open. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a rock climber on a sheer cliff face, testing every inch before committing his weight. Finally, he reached the summit. He lay flat on his belly, a tiny, unnoticed observer peering down into the heart of the zone's brutal society. From here, he had a clear view into a vast, cavernous opening in the ship's hull. It looked like a hangar bay or a cargo hold. And it was occupied, What he saw made him recalibrate his entire understanding of this dimension. The chaotic, scrounging phantoms he'd seen outside were the lowest caste. Inside the hangar, there was a different group. There were 3 of them, and they moved with a chilling purpose that set them apart. One was a woman. She was tall and severe, with short, dark hair and an expression of permanent, disdainful impatience. She wore a form-fitting suit of the same black, alien material as the ship, adorned with strange, silvery piping. She moved with the deadly, economical grace of a born warrior, her every step precise, her head constantly swiveling. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. He watched as one of the brutish outer phantoms wandered too close to the entrance. She didn't shout a warning. She simply moved, a black blur, and delivered a single, devastating strike to its throat. The brute collapsed, twitching, and she kicked it back out into the gray wastes without a second glance. The message was clear. This was their territory. Designation, Lieutenant 1, his mind whispered, already filing the data. Threat level, extreme. High combat proficiency. Enforcer. The second figure was a mountain of a man. He was huge, far larger than any human Izuku had ever seen, with a vacant, placid expression on his face. He was completely bald and wore a similar black uniform, though it was simpler, less adorned. He didn't seem to do much, merely standing guard by a strange, crystalline console that still glowed with a faint inner light. His power was latent, a feeling of immense, brutish strength held in reserve. He was a wall. A living siege engine. Designation Brute 1. Threat level, unknown, presumed extreme. Heavy defense. But it was the third figure that commanded his absolute, terrified attention. He hadn't seen him at first. He had been standing in the shadows, observing his subordinates with an air of absolute authority. When he stepped into the dim light of the hangar, Izuku felt a cold dread that eclipsed anything he had felt before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and radiated an aura of pure, undiluted command. He wore a uniform similar to the woman's, but his was accented with a flowing black cape that seemed to drink the light. On his chest, etched in black on a shield-shaped emblem, was a symbol. A stylized S. It was a strange, hauntingly familiar shape, a perversion of a pre-quirk icon of hope he'd only seen in history books. This was no symbol of hope. This was a sigil of power. He had a severe, handsome face, with a neatly trimmed goatee and eyes that burned with a cold, intelligent fire. He carried himself like a king surveying his domain, and this hangar, this wreck, this entire dimension, it was his domain. Izuku watched as one of the lesser phantoms, a reptilian-looking creature, managed to scrounge a piece of glowing metal from a debris pile. It tried to scuttle away, but the king saw it. He didn't move. He didn't shout. He simply turned his head. That, he said, his voice a low, commanding baritone that, even from this distance, seemed to vibrate in Izuku's bones, belongs to me. The reptilian creature hissed, clutching its prize, and made to run. The king's expression didn't change. It remained one of cold disappointment. He lifted his head slightly, and then 2 beams of brilliant, silent, crimson light shot from his eyes. There was no explosion. There was no grand burst of energy. There was only the silent, instantaneous application of impossible heat. The reptilian creature, the piece of metal, and the ground it stood on simply vanished. One moment, they were there. The next, there was only a patch of glowing, molten rock and the faint smell of superheated ozone that somehow managed to drift all the way up to Izuku's perch. The king blinked, the red light vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He turned away, the matter already forgotten. Izuku's mind, the analyst, the cold, logical survivor, completely and utterly shattered. For a moment, he was a child again, watching a video of All Might saving 100 people from a burning building, his mind unable to comprehend the scale of the power on display. But this was not the benevolent power of a hero. This was the absolute, merciless power of a god. A cruel god. He scrambled back from the edge of the spire, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. His carefully constructed world of rules and analysis had been built on the assumption that he was dealing with threats he could, in theory, outwit. Scavenger 1 was a predator, but it was a predictable one. The brutes outside were a mob, but they were disorganized. This was different. This was a hierarchy. This was a kingdom, and he had just witnessed an execution carried out by its king. His mind raced, trying to categorize the new data, to fit it into his notebook, but the information was too large, too terrifying. Entity designation, Sovereign 1. Known associates, Lieutenant 1 Brute 1. Capabilities, energy projection ocular. Beam type. Thermal energy output sufficient for instantaneous vaporization of rock and organic matter. Estimated temperature. He couldn't finish the thought. The numbers were meaningless. The only meaningful data point was the result. Absolute annihilation, delivered with casual, effortless grace. His quirkless punches, his training, his clever diversions with rocks, they were nothing. They were the tools of an ant trying to strategize against a boot. He pressed himself flat against the cold stone of the spire, making himself as small as possible, his entire body trembling. He was no longer just a castaway in a strange dimension. He was an illegal immigrant in a tyrannical monarchy. He was a mouse that had just discovered the lion's den was not just a cave, but a fortress, ruled by a lion who could kill with a glance. The random thugs like Krylo, the ones who had seemed like the ultimate threat, were nothing. They were just scavengers picking at the scraps left behind by the true power. The real danger in the Phantom Zone wasn't the silence, or the starvation, or the random violence. It was the cold, intelligent, organized cruelty of the man in the black cape. The man with the burning eyes and the dark, twisted symbol on his chest. Izuku Midoriya, the analyst, added a final, grim entry to his mental notebook, a conclusion that chilled him to the soul. New primary directive: avoid the fallen ship at all costs. Avoid the king and his court. I am not a player in their game. I am not even a piece on the board. I am the dust they walk on. My survival depends on one thing and one thing only, remaining utterly and completely beneath their notice. He lay there for the entire next cycle, not moving, not thinking, just letting the terror wash over him. He had found the echoes of a world far beyond his own, the remnants of a place called Krypton, and in doing so, he had discovered the true nature of his prison. It wasn't just a desolate wasteland. It was a kingdom of the damned, and General Zod was its king. The new directive was simple: do not exist. For a period Izuku measured as 10 full cycles, he followed it with the discipline of a monk. He became a ghost, a whisper of a creature haunting the periphery of the Phantom Zone. He abandoned his first cave, its location now dangerously close to the region he had mentally cordoned off as Zod's territory. He found a new sanctuary, a network of narrow, interconnected tunnels deep within a massive shard of corestone, a natural labyrinth with a dozen entrances and exits. It was a paranoid man's paradise. His life became a ritual of pure, unadulterated survival. He would spend entire cycles in the darkness of his new warren, consuming the barest minimum of the gritty ghost moss, his body a study in conservation. He'd meticulously scratch updates into a new section of his crystal notebook, his new shard pen worn down to a nub. His entries were no longer just observations. They were paranoid schematics, theoretical escape routes, detailed analyses of phantom patrol routes that he never intended to cross. He was starving. Not the sharp, demanding hunger of before, but a slow, grinding erosion of self. The moss kept him alive, but it didn't sustain him. His muscles, once hard and defined from years of UA's training, were now stringy and soft. When he removed his tattered glove, his fingers looked like long, pale twigs. The fever had subsided, but a permanent, bone-deep cold remained. He was a flickering candle flame, and the zone was a slow, patient wind. It was during the 11th cycle, huddled in his dark tunnel, that the two halves of his mind went to war. The survivor, the cold analyst born of pain and pragmatism, argued for the status quo. We are alive. This is the goal. This system works. We avoid Zod, we forage in the safe zones, we endure. Deviation from the system introduces unacceptable risk. The potential for reward is irrelevant when the cost is annihilation. But another part of him, a stubborn ember he thought had been extinguished, began to glow. It wasn't the hopeful hero Deku. It was something older. It was the quirkless boy who had refused to accept no for an answer. The boy who had studied heroes not just out of admiration, but out of a desperate, clawing need to understand a power he could never have. It was the problem solver, the strategist. And he posed a different argument. Endure is not a strategy, it is a prolonged state of dying. The current system is a decaying orbit. Our energy expenditure, however minimal, is greater than our energy intake. The moss provides hydration, not calories. Statistically, we have a finite number of cycles left before systemic failure. We are not surviving, we are waiting to die. The only logical path forward is to change the variables. The two voices battled in the silence of his mind. To stay put was to wither away, a slow, certain death. To act, to approach the one place he had forbidden himself from going, was to risk a swift, violent one, a slow death versus a fast one. It wasn't much of a choice, but the strategist had one more card to play. The Kryptonian wreck is the single greatest source of unknown variables in this dimension. Unknowns are not just threats, they are opportunities. It contains technology. Technology means energy. A power source, a functional tool, even a simple cutting laser. Any one of these things could fundamentally alter our survival equation from a net loss to a net gain. The risk is absolute, but the potential reward is continued existence. The strategist won. The decision was made. Not with hope, not with a heroic gleam in his eye, but with the cold, grim acceptance of a surgeon about to perform a life-or-death operation on himself. He would infiltrate the Kryptonian ship. He would rob the gods. The next 5 cycles were dedicated to the most intense, focused project of his life. He became a full-time intelligence officer, and General Zod's kingdom was his sole target. He established a series of forward observation posts, tiny crevices and hidden ledges, each closer to the wreck than the last. He spent entire cycles lying motionless, his stomach a tight knot of hunger and fear, just watching. His new notebook entries were a testament to his obsessive focus. He sketched the ship, which he dubbed the Phantom, from every conceivable angle. He mapped the patrol routes not just of the outer scavengers, but of Zod's 2 lieutenants. Farrell, the severe woman he designated Lieutenant 1, was the true warden of the ship. She was methodical, relentless. Her patrol route around the immediate perimeter was timed to the half-cycle. She moved with a purpose that made Carwila look like a wandering amateur. She was the first line of defense. Nan, the silent brute, was the last. He rarely moved from his post inside the main hangar, a living statue guarding the glowing console. His inaction was more intimidating than Farah's action. It spoke of a supreme, unshakable confidence in his own power. And then there was Zod. Zod was not a soldier on patrol. He was a king in his court. He rarely emerged from the deeper recesses of the ship. When he did, it was with an air of profound arrogance and boredom. He would stand at the hangar's edge, his black cape stirring in some unfelt cosmic wind, and simply survey his gray kingdom. He seemed to be waiting. Waiting for what, Izuka couldn't fathom, but his inaction was a blessing. A predictable Zod was a manageable Zod. Izuka's plan began to form, a delicate, multi-layered construct of timing and misdirection. He couldn't fight them. He couldn't outrun them. He had to outthink them on a level that bordered on precognition. His target solidified in his mind. He had watched Zod and his lieutenants interact with the various glowing consoles inside the hangar. Most were dark, but a few flickered with residual power. There was one, a smaller, secondary console near a side corridor, that seemed to be a diagnostic station. It was connected by thick, insulated cables to what looked like a portable power cell, a cylinder about the size of his forearm, glowing with a soft, steady internal light. The Kryptonians ignored it. It was clearly low priority, perhaps a backup or a battery for a non-essential system. To them, it was insignificant. To Izuku, it was the Holy Grail. The plan had 3 phases. Phase 1, the diversion. He needed to pull Farah away from her patrol. A simple rock slide wouldn't work on her, she was too disciplined. He needed something more compelling. He had noticed a group of the brutish outer phantoms had established a small territory near a field of highly unstable shatterstone. They fought constantly over scraps. He would give them something worth fighting for. Phase 2, the infiltration. While Farah was occupied, he would have a window. A terrifyingly small window, maybe only minutes, to cross the open ground, enter the hangar, and navigate to the console. This would be the most dangerous part, a sprint through the lion's den. Phase 3, the acquisition. He would need to disconnect the power cell. He had studied the connection point through his makeshift spyglass, 2 polished crystal shards held at a distance. It looked like a simple twist and lock mechanism. Simple, if your hands weren't shaking and a demigod wasn't standing 50 feet away. Then, he had to get out, retracing his steps before Farah returned. Every single step was fraught with a near certainty of failure. But the alternative was the slow, cold certainty of fading away in a dark tunnel. He spent one final cycle making his preparations. He ate a larger than usual portion of moss, hoping the meager energy would sustain him. He wove a new sling, stronger this time. He practiced the motions of his infiltration route in the safety of his tunnels until he could do it with his eyes closed. He was ready. The cycle began. He moved to his primary observation post, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He watched Farah begin her patrol, her pace as regular as a metronome. He watched the brutish phantom squabbling in the distance. He watched Nan, the silent mountain, standing his vigil. Zod was nowhere to be seen. It was now or never. Phase 1. He had gathered a handful of the brightest, most intensely phosphorescent ghost moss he could find. He bundled it together into a tight ball, a glowing lure of concentrated sustenance. From his hiding place, he used his sling to hurl the ball of moss high into the air, arcing it perfectly so it would land directly in the center of the brutish phantom's territory. The glowing ball descended like a fallen star. For a moment, the brutes froze, staring at the offering. Then, with guttural roars that were swallowed by the silence, they fell upon it. The squabble instantly escalated into a full-blown, violent riot. The silent chaos was brutal. Limbs flew, bodies were thrown. It was exactly the kind of undisciplined rabble that would attract an enforcer's attention. He watched Farah. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her head turned towards the riot. He could see the annoyance on her sharp features. This was an affront to the order Zod demanded. With a last, disdainful glance at the ship, she broke from her patrol and moved towards the fight, a black streak of lethal grace. The window was open. Phase 2. Izuku didn't hesitate. To hesitate was to die. He broke from cover and ran. The open ground between the crystal fields and the ship was a nightmare. He felt naked, exposed, a single moving dot in a vast, static landscape. He ran with a desperate, burning intensity, his sock-clad feet pounding silently on the ground. He didn't use the lifts or sinks. They were too unpredictable. He relied on pure, muscle-tearing exertion. His lungs burned. The cold, thin air was like breathing ice. He focused on the hangar entrance, the huge, dark maw that promised both salvation and death. He could see Nan inside, unmoving. The brute's back was mostly to the entrance, his attention fixed on the main console. He's not looking. He's confident. He's arrogant. He reached the edge of the ship's hull. The metal was cold and smooth under his hands. It felt ancient. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Farah was a distant figure, efficiently and brutally quelling the riot. He had time. Not much. He slipped inside the hangar. The change in environment was immediate. The air here was warmer, filled with the low, thrumming vibration of the ship's dormant heart. The sheer scale of the space was overwhelming. It was a cathedral built to honor alien gods of war. He pressed himself into the shadows along the wall, his body flat against the cold metal. His costume, tattered and grayed with crystal dust, was perfect camouflage. He was a ghost. He moved from shadow to shadow, his movements slow, deliberate, agonizingly tense. Nan hadn't moved. The brute was a statue of impending violence. Izuku's path would take him within 20 feet of the giant. He held his breath, his heart threatening to hammer its way out of his chest. He passed behind a stack of strange, metallic crates, the last piece of cover before the target console. He peered around the edge. There it was. The small console, the thick cable, the glowing cylinder. His prize. And that's when his blood ran cold. He wasn't alone. Zod was there. The general wasn't in the main chamber. He was standing in the corridor just beyond the target console, his back to Izuku, looking at something on the far wall. Izuku couldn't see what it was. All he could see was the black cape, the broad shoulders, the aura of absolute, lethal power. His mind screamed. Abort! Abort the mission! But he was already here. Retreating now was just as dangerous as moving forward. He was trapped. He was caught between Nan on one side and Zod on the other, a literal rock in a hard place, if the rock was a mountain and the hard place could vaporize him with a look. For a terrifying second, he was paralyzed. The sheer, overwhelming fear was a physical force, rooting him to the spot. His limbs refused to obey. He was going to die here. He was going to be discovered and erased from existence. Then he heard Zod speak, and the words, though not directed at him, saved his life. It is a flaw in our design, Faura, Zod said, his voice a low rumble, seemingly speaking to himself. This sentimentality. This nostalgia. He gestured to whatever he was looking at on the wall. Kal-El was a child of two worlds. He believed he could bridge them. He was a fool. You cannot build a bridge with a broken foundation. Kal-El? The name meant nothing to Izuku, but the context was clear. Zod was lost in a memory. He was distracted. His guard, however slightly, was down. It was an opening. It was a suicidal, insane, infinitesimal opening. It was the only one he would ever get. He moved. Every instinct screamed at him to be silent, but a deeper, more analytical part of his mind took over. Absolute silence was just as suspicious as noise in this place. He needed to be part of the background hum. He timed his movements with the faint, rhythmic pulse of the ship's engines. A soft footfall as the engine thrummed. A slide along the wall as a distant piece of machinery cycled. He became part of the ship's ghost in the machine noises. He reached the console. His hands, slick with cold sweat, trembled as he reached for the power cell. It was warm to the touch, humming with a life of its own. He gripped it. The locking mechanism was just as he'd seen. A quarter turned counterclockwise. He thought he could save his world by embracing theirs. Zod continued, his voice laced with a profound, ancient bitterness. He did not understand. To save Krypton, you must be Krypton. You must purge the weakness, the compromise. Izuku's fingers closed around the cylinder. His knuckles were white. He could feel Nan's presence behind him, a mountain of silent judgment. He could feel Zod's presence in front of him, a volcano of potential fury. He began to turn the cylinder. It was stiff. It hadn't been moved in centuries. His weak, malnourished arms strained. A low groan of stressed metal, no louder than a whisper, escaped the mechanism. Zod stopped talking. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Izuku had ever heard. He froze, his hands still on the partially turned cylinder. He didn't dare breathe. He could feel Zod's attention shifting, the vast weight of his focus turning from the past to the present. He was a mouse who had just squeaked in a library full of sleeping lions. Nan, Zod said, his voice dangerously soft. Did you hear that? Izuku's world ended. He was dead. This was it. The end of the line. He could picture the red beams of light. He squeezed his eyes shut. And then, from the main entrance, Faura's voice cut through the tension. General. The vermin have been disciplined. A minor disturbance. Zod's attention shifted again, snapping towards his returning lieutenant. Report. The moment of scrutiny had passed. The god's eye had looked away. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, Izuku twisted the cylinder. It came free with a soft click. The light from the console flickered and died. He had it. He hugged the warm, heavy cylinder to his chest. It was the single most precious object in the universe. He didn't wait. He didn't think. He fled. He moved back the way he came, a shadow slipping along the wall. Zod and Faura were engrossed in their report. Nan hadn't moved. He reached the hangar entrance, slipped out into the gray twilight, and ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, his quirkless legs pumping with a desperation born of pure terror. He didn't look back. Looking back was a death sentence. He just ran, the precious, warm cylinder clutched to his chest like a newborn child. He fled past the silent, moaning bodies of the disciplined brutes, past the field of Shatterstone, back into the familiar, safe territory of the outer wastes. He didn't stop until he was deep inside his labyrinthine warren, his body wedged into the deepest, darkest tunnel. He collapsed, his body shaking uncontrollably, his lungs burning. He was alive. He was alive. He had done it. He held up his prize. The Kryptonian power cell. It glowed with a soft, steady, internal blue light, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls of his cave. It was beautiful. It was a star in his personal darkness. It was a piece of an alien world, a fragment of impossible science, and it was his. He had faced the ghost and the general. He had walked into the lion's den and stolen a tooth from a sleeping god. He was covered in sweat, trembling with exhaustion and residual fear, and starving. But for the first time since he had arrived in this colorless hell, as he clutched the warm, humming power of a sun in his hands, Izuku Midoriya allowed himself to feel a single, dangerous, revolutionary emotion: hope.